Thanks, and thanks to Professor Maloney. No, I know. I was just making sure it was Professor. I'd given you the right title, Professor Maloney. Sorry, and to our team, and good luck to the Commission. Yeah, and I do think it is welcome, and I want to apologise. I have to rush over and speak in the finance bill debate as well. But it's a kind of interesting contrast in a way, because the finance bill is lots of individual measures under different headings of income, of USC, of corporate tax, of this, that, you know, property-based, but it's lots of individual measures, and you might argue that there's no sort of strategic debate going on around the finance bill and the taxation measures that are involved in it. Okay, to some degree that happens in a budget, but often that also happens in the context of a particular year, particular political pressures, and some questions kind of never get really discussed, standing back from those things. So I think this is a good, it's a good initiative, but I'd just like to sort of quiz you a little bit more about how you see yourself doing that, and to what extent you think it's possible to, first of all, have evidence-based when a lot of the issues are heavily contested, right? Not least by the people they affect, and the submissions of the people are evidence in and of themselves. Right, but it strikes me, with the best will in the world, that huge numbers of the people who maybe are most disadvantaged economically will be the least likely to even know this is happening, and not terribly well equipped to engage with it. Do you accept that that's a concern, and that that's something that we've got to kind of address? How do we get the voices of those who are generally not heard on issues like tax, what it should be there for, about welfare and what it should achieve, heard, when it will tend to be, for want of a better word, the political nerds and the people who know about these things or whatever? I mean, one thing I was saying in terms of public consultations in a slightly different context is we should have ads advertising these public consultations, radio ads, saying there's a serious look at tax in this country and what it's for and how fair is it and do you think it's working for you, and welfare, and actually advertising that fact. Now, of course, if you did that, you probably would get a lot of submissions, a lot more than a couple of hundred, but then you'd have even more work on your hands. But I just want to run that by you, because there is a danger in any public consultation that the voices that are often not heard will not be heard again, with the best will in the world, right? So I just want to ask that. Also, you might just say quickly what you see our role in this. I mean, is today the day for us to give you suggestions as to what we think? I don't think we probably have time today, but it's certainly, I think most people in our committee, and possibly some other committees in here, would like to have a discussion about what are the big strategic questions on tax and welfare that need to be addressed, and our views about how they should be addressed. So you might just say a word about that. But like, just to give you a couple of examples, I mean, I think wealth taxes need to be discussed. Right? That happen in some places. They've generally been resisted in this country, but there's a real debate about them. It's a debate that also is very relevant to the climate debate at the moment. I mean, to give a big bold statement, I think unless you deal with the gross and growing inequality in wealth and income in the world, you will not address the climate emergency. I put it as bluntly as that. Now, not everybody shares that opinion, but I share it. I'm absolutely convinced of that. That where, you know, and I think it's pretty undisputed fact that the 1%, as they famously are called, or call them the 10%, who own, 50 or 60% of the wealth in this country, and that's generally repeated around the world, whereas the bottom 50% have about 2% of the wealth between them or less, then unless you address that, I cannot see how you could address the climate emergency, right? Is that sort of just thing going to be something that you look at? And then, you know, what are the serious arguments? And do you feel that at the end of that you'll be able to take a position on things like that? Or to give you another example, I looked at your survey, and I feel it's a little bit loaded, and you might respond to this, about the local property tax and the site value tax. Now, first of all, I still struggle to fully understand what a site value tax is, as against the local property tax. And I'd say a lot of people would. But there's also other options that I think are not considered in that binary question that you're asking. I mean, I favour a multiple property tax for the non-principal private residents, right? And I bet you if you ask people, should people with multiple properties be taxed on their property wealth as against just the person with the family home, I think you'd probably get a majority would say, yeah, that's fairer. So why isn't that question asked? Or should it be asked? Or will you ask it? So that's just another example. And, you know, I mean, there's some things that maybe don't even occur to people unless you sort of put the facts out in front of them. I mean, one of the things that very much struck me in looking at tax coming into this budget, particularly in the aftermath of COVID, is that following a consistent pattern over recent years, but it seemed to even be more pronounced during COVID, is that corporate profits went through the roof. So I think this year pre-tax corporate profits was 203 billion. That's about 127% more than it was a decade ago. And they pay about 11 billion euro in tax. All of the workers in this country earn 127 billion, nearly about half, a little bit more than half of what the corporations earned, but they paid 27 billion in tax. So to me, that's a radical disparity between the corporate sector making huge profits and making a much smaller tax contribution relative to their profit income, as against workers having less income between all of them, but paying a much higher proportion in absolute and relative terms in tax. Are those sort of issues going to be addressed and discussed and sort of put to people? So, look, there's a few questions, and I could think of a lot more.
You have lots to address there. I think we'll all just pass by the fact that he's called us all political nerds, and you might address some of them.
Well, I include myself, by the way, in that.
Thank you very much, Deputy, and many thanks again for it's great to, we really do very much appreciate your engagement with us this evening. I mean, yeah, that's very. Thank you so much. These are really rich observations. I'll take them, I think, in order as best I can. I think just the first point you mentioned there, Deputy, on evidence-based. I mean, I think just to be sure I was clear on this issue. We're producing papers as we go, and we will be publishing all of those at the end of our once our final report is published. We'll also be publishing the different papers that have informed our work. So, we're very, very keen to take an evidence-based approach and show to colleagues and to everybody affected, how we went about our decision making. And I think in terms of, you make a really good point about consultations, that they are tricky things, aren't they? I mean, on the one hand, we do them to try and engage as many voices as possible, small businesses, households, individuals, to try and capture as diverse a range of opinions as possible. Particularly, when you consider the last time this exercise was done 10 or 12 years ago, we didn't have these kinds of tools. It was very difficult to, kind of wide-ranging public consultations. Digitalization has just made all of this so much more possible. But I completely take your point about how to engage with as wide a group of people as possible. So I think, just on a purely functional level, we're absolutely using all different kinds of outreach, different kinds of media. But I think the other thing I think I'd mention here is around the table at the Commission, we have all sorts of expertise and experience, but I think there is a very strong collective commitment to the importance of tax and welfare, of those systems being fair and equitable. And the most vulnerable in society. I mean, that is expressly called out in our terms of reference, but I think it's something that we all as a group feel deeply conscious of, and that the importance of those two systems and how they interact, that interaction is particularly important for those who are most vulnerable in our society. So I think we're hoping to have as broad an outreach as possible, but it is something that we as a Commission hold very close in our deliberations and in how we're approaching these different issues. So we're very, very conscious of that. In terms of our engagement with you, Deputy, it's hugely valuable. I mean, this whole exercise this evening, I can certainly say from my perspective, and I'm sure speaking on behalf of the Commission, this interaction with you is extremely valuable. We would be hugely appreciative if deputies were available to respond to our consultation. But of course, any bilateral engagement, if you we're able to write into the Commission, we will be absolutely delighted to learn from submissions you and colleagues may be making. So we value that very, very greatly. And then I very much take your point about the scale of the issues and the kind of the great debate, if you like, that is necessary about some of these big questions. And you mentioned wealth tax and the link between inequality and the just transition and the huge carbon challenge that we're all facing. You mentioned property tax and site value tax. And I think there is, in some ways, that shows us, I think, the scale of what we're dealing with. Because on the one hand, there are huge choices about how one designs a tax system. What basis do you use? Who is taxed, depending on what those bases are, you know, whether it's income or consumption or different sources of wealth. And then you devolve right into the seemingly technical but really important questions about, you know, how is local property tax designed? How is something like a site value tax designed? How is something like, you know, some other tax designed? And our job is to stand back and try and make sure the technical design choices fit within a coherent system that supports economic activity, supports prosperity, supports employment, while also ensuring we are protecting the most vulnerable in society by the big decisions we make about how the tax and welfare systems work. And these are big debates that are happening internationally. I mean, we saw even in the last number of weeks, the Biden administration, very, very big debates there about the role of a wealth tax and how it might be designed. There's big debates in the UK right now. They have a commission on wealth taxation. There were also very big debates around the role of public health and taxation. So I think I think as a commission, these are big questions, but we are, if you like, in the right place at the right time. There are very, very big debates internationally, generational debates, about how one as a society, what we owe each other, and how do we express what we owe each other, whether it's through paying our taxes or through supporting those who are vulnerable through the welfare system. So I think we very much embrace the opportunity to do both of those things, to stand back and have a serious debate about the role of the different taxes and how they support welfare and how the two interact, but also to have a strategic, a coherent look at the technical components of the system, because if they're not working together correctly, that feeds back into the overall design of the system. And again, Deputy, we will hugely welcome your engagement with us, and indeed all colleagues on the Budgetary Oversight Committee. If I may just make maybe a small footnote, we've already found hugely helpful the committee's 2019 report into the review of tax expenditures, and we very much welcome your engagement with us, and indeed thank you in advance for it.
One line, additional question. Yeah, and absolutely, I'm delighted you've highlighted the tax expenditures, just to say that in your thing, and that's great that we're looking into them. Just one last question. To what extent, at the end of kind of looking at these areas like wealth tax, like tax and the climate crisis, and you know, property-based taxes, for example, or the corporate tax area, to what extent do you see yourself at the end of that process, having looked at evidence and listened to the public, then actually making recommendations as to the adoption of those things? I mean, do you envisage a situation where the Commission might say at the end of this, yes, actually we are recommending a wealth tax, or we are recommending that, you know, the corporations are paying too little or too much. You know, you might argue, I hope you don't argue that, but that they're paying too little, or do you know what I mean? Or do you see yourself just setting out options at the end of all of this?
So, Deputy, many thanks for your question, and I can be completely unequivocal about this. Absolutely, yes. You know, we are in the business of making serious, practical, evidence-based recommendations that we very much hope will stand the test of time, that are they're sustainable over a 10, 15, 20-year period, but absolutely, we want to make a serious contribution to how public policy works in this country as regards tax and welfare. Our mission is to produce specific recommendations, and we are aiming for these recommendations to be credible, coherent, and evidence-based. So absolutely, and I think it is something that really animates us. I think that sense that we can make a serious contribution and make recommendations for political process then to work with is absolutely, I think, something we take with the utmost seriousness.
And sorry, just if I have one more sentence, just very specifically, because I am interested, will you be looking specifically at the area of wealth taxes?
So thanks very much, Deputy. So our terms of reference asks us to look at the, to stand back and look at the overall tax system. And one of the things we are asked to look at in one of our terms of reference is the balance of taxation in terms of earned income, consumption and wealth. So this sense of how the different bases work together, would form, I think, a logical part of any stand back look of a tax system. I mean, there's one of the things that is important when one is looking at the tax system as a whole is all the different sources of income, of wealth, of consumption. There's different ways, of course, of thinking about something like a wealth tax, whether it's wealth taxes on sources of wealth, whether that's property or capital gains or capital acquisitions or dirt or whatever it is. But I think thinking about the different sources through which tax operates. Are they operating as effectively as possible? Are the right levers being pulled in the right place? Learning from international experience. There are very, very big debates internationally about all of this right now, and we will absolutely be thinking seriously about these big, big questions about how tax systems should be designed.
Okay, that's your lot, Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Thank you.
Deputy